Your love and your faithfulness go above the lofty skies. Mighty is your righteousness, higher than the mountains peaks. Yeah, higher than the mountain. Yeah, higher than the mountain. Oh Lord, you preserve men and be.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Jord.
Hi, Phil, and evening, Tim.
Hi,
Evening
Tim.
both. Lovely to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. So, what are we looking at tonight, Jord?
Well, we're still in book 1, Phil, but we are going to be looking at Psalm 36 tonight with Tim. So we're definitely right at the end now of book 1. We're seeing the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel, and closing in on book 2, which is really exciting. And I think we're going to see perhaps a few of those big themes that we've considered in the past. It's got a title, this psalm, another Psalm of David. And I think we're going to see that aspect of steadfast love that we considered a few videos ago. So perhaps quite an encouraging one to reflect again on that love, that security that God shows to us and that we can have in him. So I'll stop talking now and stop sharing my screen and hand over to Tim to share some thoughts for us on Psalm 36.
Thank you. I suppose when thinking about this, what is the challenging time that this psalm helps with? Obviously, the pandemic is a huge one that is happening right at this moment of recording, isn't it? And this psalm is an interesting one as it deals with the thoughts of the wicked and the actions of the wicked. So it gives us a bit of a window into how wicked people think and the actions and how that contrasts quite nicely with God. Actually helps us to understand that God is the way rather than the wicked. And in times of crisis, in difficult times, we see the wicked really and their actions and the greed. And a lot of people do have those. I'm not sure if you both have really seen that in leaders around the world and some of the actions that they've made. Brazil and India definitely pop up at the minute with a booming numbers of rising dead and ill in India at this very moment because of neglect of the poor and the needy. And this psalm deals with issues like this and talks about how God would challenge those things. So just before we start, there is a title. It's nice that you have that as a kind of theme, and it says in the ESV, to the choir master of David, the servant of the Lord. Do either of you know who else called themselves the servant of the Lord, or who else was called the servant of the Lord?
That's a good question. I think Moses is called the servant of the Lord a few times, isn't he?
Yes, that's right. That is the correct answer, Phil. Well done.
There's only one, is there? Okay.
One bonus point for you. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, back in Deuteronomy, he is called the servant of the Lord. And yeah, why do you think David would want to, in this psalm, maybe align himself with Moses? Because I believe he is probably.
I suppose he was king possibly at this time when this psalm was written, and like Moses, a leader of the people. And reflecting on perhaps this injustice that was taking place, it was helpful to look back at the past, possibly, Tim.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice thought. Yeah, we can probably develop this as we talk through tonight as well. Why he does decide to do that, and the implications of being a leader, and thinking about what other leaders do around the world is it's a huge responsibility. And if anyone has responsibility, of family members or home or vulnerable members or people who are looking for refugee status, you have a responsibility, don't you? And the responsibility of that has to be a godly response. So yeah, to align yourself then with Moses, someone who was a leader of the people, you just said, Jord was, yeah, I think that's a really good shout with that. But we can think about this as we go through this session tonight. So should we read this together? Phil, would you like to read it?
Yeah, sure. Psalm 36. To the choir master of David, the servant of the Lord. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. There the evildoers lie, fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise.
Yeah, thanks for that. Do either of you know what foil is?
Foil, did you say?
Foil, yeah. Have you heard of foil?
I've heard a few different words. The word foil, meanings of the word foil. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Can you give me a few, Phil?
I guess one of them is that pressed metallic aluminium that you roll out to use in the kitchen.
Great. You can put that one to one side.
Good.
Which is one? That's the easy.
I'll let
answer
Jord
then.
do the next one then.
One,
he can get the points this time.
Is it the idea of like to foil someone's plans?
Ooh.
No?
No, I wasn't going for that. But that is an answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't get the points for that one then.
Anyone else?
To foil.
Any more ideas?
Oh, a sword, like a jav. They sometimes when you do fencing, they call them the foils.
Oh, there's loads of answers I wasn't expecting here. This is bonus points for everyone. Bonus points for everyone here. Also.
Tim, what's a foil?
Have you heard of like foil for a diamond? Have you heard of this?
No.
It's a platform that basically is a reflective platform. So similar in a way to tinfoil, but not. And it's meant to increase the luster of the diamond. So often you notice how much more it shines when it's on this kind of surface.
Right.
You might have also heard of character foils as well, maybe in story writing, whereas you have certain characters with certain aspects around the main character to emphasize a certain aspect of that character. So again, that one's a bit more removed from tin foil, isn't it? Isn't it, Phil, really? But this is definitely a psalm of contrast to both enhance how you understand wickedness in the sight of God, so how terrible this thing is because God is so amazing, but also how wonderful God is in the sight of this aspect of how wicked something is. So the very start, you have this very honest description of sin speaking in the heart. I really love that phrase. That this sin speaks in a transgression or sin speaks to the wicked deep in his heart, and how that is something so deeply rooted within themselves that it affects their very perception of God, and how they can't even come before God. They can't fear God or understand him before his eyes. So I'm not sure what you both think of that, about sin speaking in the heart. But this is part of the challenge, isn't it, that we're thinking about why this psalm is applicable in challenging times.
Yeah, it made me think of out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Words of Jesus, I'm just trying to remember where they are. I think it's Luke 6:45, that what's in your heart will eventually show itself in what you say or what you do. And I guess that if you got, was it transgression deep in your heart, as you said, Tim, that's something that will show itself at some point.
It reminded me, similar to that, Phil, of when Jesus talks about the two men who went to the temple and prayed, and the publican, or the Pharisee who was proud, prayed to himself. And it doesn't say heart, but it's almost like he prayed within himself to himself, which is almost like as bad as what the wicked were doing here, isn't it? It's not a godly way. Like you said at the start, Tim, it's this opposite thing to what godliness is all about. It's just what it made me think of when you mentioned about that idea of within yourself, or talking within your heart.
Well, that's exactly what verse 2 says, Jord, actually, isn't it? That he flatters himself in his own eyes. So, yeah, you're right. The publican is a really good example of that, because he prayed to himself. It says that, doesn't it? So What you do have already is saying, it says, God, the fear of God isn't in his eyes, but he is in his own eyes. This person who is deep, has this kind of sin in them growing, is not reflecting on their own behavior or their own desires, and centering themselves around God and his word. And that can be all of us, of course. And that's the part. If we're not careful with the desires that, the natural desires that we have within ourselves, then we can go down this route of putting ourselves in front of our eyes instead of God. But that comes from the heart, which is an interesting point, really. And then from that, verse 3 and 4 then talk about the actions. So we have this internal focus first, as you were talking about, Phil, but that then turns into action. So verse 3, the words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. So the words come out. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. So presumably he once acted wisely and did good as well. That's what the inference is with that one as well. All as teachers, we talk about inference quite a lot as well, don't we? So so it's good to kind of bring that up and look between the lines there. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good, and he does not reject evil. And we can see that evolves throughout this. So at the end of verse 4, he doesn't reject evil, but what do you spot at the very end? There the evildoers lie fallen. So it does actually make a nice kind of link there, doesn't it, between the two, of wicked kind of growing and turning from something about you thinking, sitting on your bed and thinking about these and planning these evil things, to actually doing them, which is the hard part, really.
Because I noticed, as you were saying, Tim, it's easy to think, well, the wicked, that's them over there, or that person that's done something quite extreme that we might think. But that verse 1, there's no fear of God before his eyes. That's actually picked up in the New Testament in Romans 3, verse 18, where Paul is making this argument saying, we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. This is just one of a catalogue of different quotes he gets from the Old Testament to sort of prove that none of us are perfect, none of us are righteous, and that would be the foil that God is the only one that's righteous.
Yeah, and with that point, we have the clear contrast, don't we, of God being the shining diamond in verse 5, really against that. And there's a really interesting pattern here, and I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on this and draw this out a bit with you both, if that's okay. So notice the directions in these two verses. Verse 5 and 6, your steadfast love, O Lord. Let me read that again. Verse 5, your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. So the pattern I see is up, 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 down, which sounds like a PlayStation 2 cheat, doesn't it? Let's be honest. But you can see the steadfast love is up, extending to the heavens. Your faithfulness, to the clouds, again, up and up. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God, up, and your judgments are like the great deep, so going downwards. Why? What do you both think? I've got an answer, but I'd be interested to hear your first thoughts on this.
So this aspect, Tim, of almost we've got 3 ups and then a down, and perhaps what we can draw from that, is that your question? I suppose just initially thinking about that, just thinking about this sort of in relation to my life at times, we can perhaps think about God and look at God in a way that is up and far away and not almost tangible at times, and almost feel disconnected. And I think what we've seen with David an awful lot in these Psalms is when David's felt like that, and when he's called to God and tried to align himself with godly ways, God has come down to him in a sense. Or we've looked a lot, haven't we, at that idea full of, if we try and draw near to God, he will draw near to us. So I don't know, just on first thoughts, that aspect of God is so high, in times 3, if we want to, think about it in that way. And yet God does almost, reaches out to us if we're prepared to reach out to him, I suppose.
That's nice. I hadn't really thought about the number as much, Jord, but I like that it is there's more positivity there, isn't there, that we get from God, really, that the steadfast love, as one of your themes, leads with that, which is really important. Faithfulness and righteousness, they're the benefits of that God gives to mankind, isn't it? And that far stretches the kind of the judgment that he has to do, in a way. That's an interesting thought. Any thoughts from you, Phil?
I was just trying to think about, in many ways it shows that the full extent, doesn't it, from right to the heavens and right to the deep. And these are places that are generally quite difficult, or back in David's time even inaccessible by man and woman, that you can't easily just get into the clouds or into the heavens or climb to the top of a mountain, or, correct me if I'm wrong, but is the deep around like the depths of the ocean, I imagine it to be, that these are this sort of far beyond what we can easily do naturally. I was just trying to work out if there was any potential relationship as to why three of those ones are, was it steadfast love, faithfulness, and righteousness are all right at the top and judgment right at the bottom. But they both seem to be places, anyway, that's the theme that's coming up for me at the moment, that are very difficult to get to.
I think they're like tangible play. You see them, don't you? And it ties in concepts that are maybe more difficult to contemplate on without thinking of attaching to them to something physical and tangible. And, you know, who doesn't see the sky in a day? Who doesn't see the heavens or cloud or, you know, I'm not sure which county people are watching this in, but mountains, some of them are very flat in England, aren't they? And to stand over a huge body of water, have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt the depth of deep water or been in the ocean, and you feel that you could just drop all the way to the bottom? You just almost like a fear of heights in a way. There's like a awe there, isn't there? And they kind of deepen each of these attributes that God shows, I think, here. So I think you're definitely right in saying, Jord, that, you know, it's the times three there. I love that phrase that you put, but also, yeah, you attaching this, Phil, to something physical is certainly important. And the one really that I want to think about, because it's not often a positive spin on God, is judgment, actually. And that's, I think, one of the key focuses of David in this psalm, and how he deals with challenge and challenging times, and therefore how we can deal with challenging people, wicked people in this world who go out to hurt the motherless and the orphaned and the poor and the downtrodden. That's an important way to view this world and deal with evil. So let's just contemplate on your judgments are like the great deep. I'll pick that one phrase for us to think about. Which judgments come to mind that deal with depth to you, Phil and Jord? This is going to be you both talking. This is my judgment. I'm going to judge you to answer all my tricky questions tonight. Yeah, which judgments happen at a depth in Scripture that come to your minds?
I suppose the first one is, well, not the first one, but the first one that came to my mind with those two things was when God judges the Egyptians and the Red Sea literally comes upon them. So they're drowned in the depths by the judgment of God. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, and presumably washed out to wherever it is to go even further, isn't it? You know, for their attitude of dealing with God's people. Yeah, that one came to my mind quite strongly. And you see a lot of that in Psalms. So many Psalms look back on coming out of Egypt, even to the point where David said he's the servant of the Lord, like Moses. And then he's talking about judgment at a depth. You think, yeah, there's a bit more to it than just that phrase. He's probably hinting back at that one quite strongly, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about you, Phil?
I'm just thinking of judgment is quite related to justice, isn't it? That to put something right, or to say whether something is right or wrong, isn't it? And then with God, if he's making a judgment, he's making it very clear what's right and what's wrong, I guess, in a situation. And sometimes that can be in a dramatic way, like George mentioned with the Red Sea crossing. That was quite clear that God was saving his people Israel and destroying the people of Egypt. I'm just pondering about what the deep might mean, whether sometimes the depths can be in terms of the severity of the judgment. Maybe you would go, wow, I wouldn't have expected God to respond in that way, like killing the firstborn of all the Egyptians. Or for me, just was thinking the next step for the people of Israel crossing Egypt was then they got to the promised land and God said, no, so this generation's not going to be going in, and you're going to have to walk around for 38 more years in the wilderness. And like, wow, that's quite a deep or severe judgment. And even Moses in his own life had God brought judgments on him. You can think, wow, you appeared to have just hit the rock and in anger, but now you're missing out and going into the promised land. But wow, that's a pretty deep judgment of God if it's to do with that sort of what we might feel as being severe. But it was all righteous because it was for an important purpose, and Moses won't miss out as being a faithful man. So there's that sort of element of what we might see as being confusing, possibly even unfair if we don't understand it properly. But in God's mind, because his ways are far above our ways and our thoughts far above ours, that God knows the right judgments to make in a situation, even though we might not understand it or see it as extreme or unfair or not even realize why he even did it, I guess, at times.
I think that's a really important point, actually, Phil, that these aspects belong to God. They don't come from us. Again, thinking about our hearts, it's not, we don't spontaneously create the right judgment, do we, in our characters? But these judgments belong to God, as does his righteousness and steadfast love and faithfulness, and we can learn those aspects from him. But his judgments, we have to trust that the injustices that happen in this world will be put right, but not from our own point of view. And when those judgments happen, which, God willing, they'll happen soon with the return of Jesus, we will know they'll be right because we'll see them. And a good example that I was fishing for, excuse the pun, is Jonah, who obviously was asked to. I'll just go back. I don't like saying obviously. Sorry. He was asked to go to preach to the people of Nineveh, a very wicked nation, and they're called a wicked nation a lot in Scripture, and known for being terrible at the time, even by surrounding historical contemporary sources. And he said, I don't want to go preach to them. They don't deserve salvation effectively. And he was judged by God in a way, wasn't he? Because he was thrown overboard and then swallowed up a great fish. And he was in the great deep for days. And that was a kind of judgment on him, except we know God saved him. We know that he could have died and should have died, but was brought back from the depths. And was that lesson there to teach him about who should be judging? That if it was up to Jonah, would everyone be in the depth? Would he have been in the depth if he was judged by himself? Of course, because mankind's judgment is not a good judgment, is it? And we see the same in David, obviously. And we have a lovely pattern here of David also, judging himself in a lovely parable where Nathan the prophet was talking about, a shepherd stealing a neighbour's sheep, and David's, condemning that man to death, and then Nathan the prophet, I'm paraphrasing massively, but Nathan the prophet saying, "You're the man who stole the sheep." And by the way, that sheep represents Bathsheba, who you stole from, one of God's men who's fighting in your army, and you killed that man. And he judged himself, as would we all do. But the beauty of Christ and God is that we've been given this way out of being judged to death, from all going to the deep, and being brought back up to the heavens and the clouds and the mountains, the steadfast love, the faithfulness, and the righteousness of God by using his attributes. And just kind of on Christ as sorry, George.
Sorry, I was just going to say on a quick point Tim, of what you were just talking about, and thinking about the depths. It reminded me of an example in Micah where God is passing judgment on Israel. And the very end of the book of Micah, in chapter 7, verse 18, it says this. It says, "Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in steadfast love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. He will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea and show his faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as he has sworn." I just thought that sort of tied in quite nicely some of the things that we've been talking about that aspect of God's judgment being like the depths, and how our sins will be cast into the depths of the sea, just like they were for his people, even though they're not deserving of that. And like you were saying, that's a beautiful thing that we have in God through his son.
That's lovely, because it's like, rather than us going down to the depths, it's the sins, isn't it? Just like sacrifices, Christ died for us so that we don't die, isn't it? And
Absolutely.
you have lots of those kind of imageries of, this is what should be happening to us, but this is actually what happens to our sins. Our kind of, we are crucified daily. You hear that in the New Testament, don't you? That we put to death the old man so that we can live in Christ. That's a Paul's kind of phrase, isn't it? So yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point. And just kind of on that, when we think about Christ as well, coming to him, we've already kind of talked a bit about him. We know that he was buried. He was put in a tomb, but it wasn't deep. I think that's an interesting kind of point to think about, wasn't it? It was in a cave, because he wasn't judged by God, was he? He was judged by man's corruption, man's kind of greed, and man's want and jealousy, and man's also laziness through Pilate, of not wanting to deal with this man and his teachings. So because he was judged by man, the grave couldn't hold him. He was not deep at all, so much so that the stones themselves rolled away when God's angels came down. And that just says something again about man's judgment. And Psalms for Challenging Times, we see lots of judgment by lots of people, but that means nothing compared to God's judgment. We should take heart in that, I think.
So where does this psalm go next, Tim, in the sense of we started perhaps in the first 4 verses with, talking about the wicked, and then it turns to God's steadfast love and those comparisons that we've looked at. Where does it sort of start to go towards the latter end?
So we have a nice pattern, don't we, of the wicked, and what they do and say, and how they think God, what he is thinking and doing for his people. And then we have in verses 7 to 9 an explanation of how precious God's love is. So it kind of David explores this, and the precious nature. I love that the steadfast love has been a theme of yours, and David is saying how precious this is, and uses some beautiful language like sheltering under the shadow of your wings. The children of mankind do that. And in 1 John chapter 3 verse 1, we see that it goes from the children of mankind. That's where we start as the children of mankind. And 1 John 3 verse 1 says, "See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called the children of God. And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him." And that's an interesting phrase that comes in this psalm as well. So we go from the children of mankind taking refuge under God, trusting in him, because we know him. That's what that says at the end of that wonderful verse. And that same phrase also comes up in verse 10 of Psalm 36. "I will continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart." So you have some beautiful links there between the two. And that is very key, to know God, to have a relationship with him, to understand this precious gift of his steadfast love, in order to approach him and be sheltered by him from challenging times, from judgments that the world throw on us. But also then these parabolic languages goes on to talk about an abundant feast in the house, and also drinking from the river of the delights. And there's a lovely symbol there of the river being this inexhaustible source of constant flowing water, a fountain of life, which we see in the New Testament quite a lot. Jesus talks about that specifically to the Samaritan woman, which is lovely. It's a beautiful language. And then this very interesting phrase that I'm sure lots of people will have really picked up on when hearing it, because it really stands out to a lot of people. In your light, do we see light? What do you boys take from that phrase?
Well, I think we've perhaps picked up on this before. I think we saw it with Kitson, didn't we, Phil? The aspect of light.
Psalm 27.
Light. And we look back at how God created light in the beginning. And then we sort of, I think, looked at Psalm 119, verse 105, with God's word is like a light to our feet and it directs us. And I suppose it's in that light that God provides for us that we can see and know the way to God and to his kingdom, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also might come to it when we get to this psalm, but there's a phrase that is a little bit like this, but illuminates it a little bit more. Psalm 56, verse 13. You've delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. And I guess light can come from different sources, perhaps, but it's in God's light that we can almost recognize what's true. Talks a lot about the true light in the New Testament. Yeah, so it reminds me of Psalm 56, verse 13. For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. It's then going to other areas of related themes, but walking before God in light, in this light of life, is quite a powerful idea. And if we are looking back at the psalm and thinking of, well, how is it that in God's light that we see light? I haven't fully got my head around this, but you can try and hide from the light, or you can try and look towards the light, and it's looking to God that we can see this light. Whereas in John chapter 3, we find that there's people that want to hide from the light because the light exposes their wicked deeds. It shows that they're evil. And that's probably what we all want to do at times, but like Jonah that you were talking about before, Tim. But it's this sort of, we're approaching this light to be guided by it, to see it, to find God, almost by looking towards it, looking towards the source. That's what comes to my mind, and that's where there's life and light.
It reminded me a little bit on the back of that, Phil, in a New Testament verse in Corinthians, where it says, "For God, who has commanded the light to shine out of darkness, has shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." I suppose that's another way of God demonstrating that light and how we can show that light as well.
It's lovely that as well, as it shines on the heart. That's what you said, wasn't it, Jord?
Yeah.
And that again brings us back to the start of Psalm 36, talking about the wickedness of the heart and how, actually things that come out of the heart that's where sin fosters and grows. But if we allow God to come in and change the heart, if we see the light and let it come in and change us from within, transform the renewing of our minds and who we are, then that's how we change and we become more like Him. That's how we see that light, isn't it? So again, at the very start, another beautiful link in this chapter. What's in front of the eyes really matters. Is it the fear of God, or is it yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at? As Phil said, are you turning to the light? Are you turning to look at God, or are you looking at yourself in the darkness, in the depth? That's where again it all kind of links together. It's quite nice, isn't it? That in the darkness, in the depth where the judgment is, death is, there's no light there. 6 feet under at least, you won't be able to see anything. But if you're in the clouds, if you're in on the tops of the mountains, if you're up high, it's a light place to be, isn't it? If you're in the steadfast love of the Lord, if you're in His faithfulness, if you're in His righteousness, all these things that are owned by Him, you're surrounded by the light, and you're looking at those things, and that's where you change. That's where you don't allow wickedness to come out of you and be judged by God for that.
Really made me think as well, Tim. You made the point at the start about how the servant of the Lord was perhaps David, thinking back to Moses. And with Dan the other week, when we looked at the order, not Dan, sorry, Richard the other week, we looked at the order of the Psalms. He looked at Psalm 91, didn't we, from Psalm 90, and how it talks about God's dwelling and being a refuge and how He shelters. And Psalm 90 was a psalm of Moses, and I think Richard sort of suggested that Psalm 91 as well could have been a psalm of Moses as well. But I just thought it was interesting what you were saying, Tim, in thinking about this for ourselves and using examples of old to sort of learn from. That, in these different things that come out about they feast on the abundance of God. In the wilderness, God fed them every day with the manna, didn't He? He gave them water to drink. We read of different accounts of them drinking from, I think, Elam and the rock that Moses struck. And out of that came fountains of water. And also, they were always surrounded by God's light. It was the pillar of fire by day and by night, and the cloud by day. And I just suppose, even at times they felt, in the darkness, they felt isolated. They grew weary. And I suppose that's what the journey of the wilderness is all about, isn't it? It's a lesson for us that we're all going through these ups and downs, these peaks and troughs in our life, just like they did. But God's light is always there if we do look for it, even though it can be challenging to try and find that sometimes, or perhaps we don't want to look for it because it exposes things that we perhaps don't want it to expose.
The psalm finishes off then quite nicely as well in verse 10. We talked about this again, the steadfast love coming to those who know you, so those who have reached out to have a relationship with God. And then again, lovely link, the second part of verse 10, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. So you have, again, looking back to Foyle, we have the wicked deep in his heart in verse 1. The very end, we have this opportunity to have an upright heart. Your righteousness to the upright of heart. To be right, isn't it, will be given to those who are upright in heart. And that's a lovely thought, isn't it, that those who are just self-centered and just thinking about themselves, they'll be judged and left to that. But, to be right is given to those who have focused on their heart and looked into the light of God and changed themselves in accordance to how he wants us to change in a positive way, to look after people who need it, rather than to have this very negative impact that we see in verse 11 that David is saying, don't let the foot of the arrogant come upon me. So again, another kind of strong word, like with those who really focus on themselves. Arrogance is a word you do see in people who do flatter themselves in their own eyes, and it's difficult for a lot of people to kind of deal with. I think, like in the workplace, you meet arrogant people, don't you? And it's not pleasant. They're not pleasant people to be around often. But the hand of the wicked is driven away as well. These people who have actual impact, who were having an actual impact upon David. And you see, he's saying, I don't want to be affected by that because I see your goodness, really. And then, finishes by saying that, well, those who are the evildoers, will lie fall, and they are thrust down, unable to rise. And that is the ultimate judgment of God. That is the somber kind of note that this psalm ends on, but is an important one and is an encouraging one as well, because it's easy to think it's a very negative thing, God's justice or judgment. But when you just reflect on the horrible state of the world and some of the things that are happening in countries, and the way the poor are afflicted, and the way that people are treated, and even country being against country, fighting for vaccines, and you see the bare nature of mankind and how it needs to be put right, and God is the one who will be putting that right. We have an inbuilt want for justice, and that will come, and God's promised that, and David explores this here, both personally but also wanting it on a larger scale for the world, and that's encouraging to me.
Fantastic. So, Jord, what would you see as a key point then for us to take from this, for us living in challenging times?
I actually want to take 2 points tonight, because I'd got a point that I was really going to take from tonight, and then where Tim...
Are you allowed 2 points? Is this part of the system, Jord? Can I ask?
I don't know. It'll be the first time if it is, Tim. No, I think my original point that I was thinking about to take from tonight was this whole aspect of how we thought before about almost like the structure and how it comes in, and it felt like you'd really done that tonight, Tim, where you'd focused on the outset, the wicked, and then we'd moved in, and then the very centre was like looking at that steadfast love of God and how good God is towards us. But I think actually I will have 1 point. My take-home point from that was how you focused on the judgment of God and actually trying to see that in a positive way, and thinking about how actually we all, in our own lives, have injustices, probably at a lesser level than others do. But like you said, we see it all over the world, and we really pray for that time that we looked all those weeks ago in Psalm 2 of when God will send Jesus back to the earth as his king to rule in justice. And that's what I think most people want, someone who's going to judge righteously and fairly and treat people equally. And that's a really lovely, as you said, not a negative thing, but a really lovely thing to think about and go away and pray for as well. So, yeah, I think that's my one take-home point for today's session. But thanks for tonight, Tim. That was really engaging, and the questions were very thought-provoking and definitely caused me to reflect. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's lovely to be here with you guys. Lovely psalm as well. Thank you.
Great, and thank you to everyone who's watched this video. We pray that it will help you in your appreciation of God and his ways, and may God bless you as you continue to consider these things as we do. Till next time, God willing. Bye.
God bless.